a lot of people are buying these sort of prefab tiny homes. You know, those are like all the rage where they build them in a factory and deliver them. Is that something that you recommend, or do you recommend it's better to just build something on your property?
So again, from a government perspective, I'm like, give people options, right? And so people will pick the best options for themselves. Tiny homes, what I will flag for consumers is like, hey, these aren't always built to the code of a home.
Mm,
Like it says house in it, but it's not. It could be built to ANSI standards, ANSI. It could be built as like a park model RV. It could be a motorized thing. It could be a lot of different standards. And so make sure you know what you're buying and that you can do what you think you can with it. And you do that by getting the specs from the supplier or the vendor and bringing them to your planning department and saying like, "Hey, will I be allowed to put this on my property? And what would the process actually be like?" And a lot of the time, the planner just tells you like, "Oh, that's going to be more complicated than just building something on your property for what you want to do."
yeah.
But having said that, all those caveats aside, I love tiny homes. I think they're an extra option, right? And they're a very light cost option, which is what's missing right now. So if you look at a place like Portland again, where they've adopted really light barrier to entry to set, you can get a permit for a tiny home hookup. So like you just go and put down a pad for the camper or the tiny house. You put in utility water hookups. I forget what they do for plumbing, but in any case, you can do that really light, and for a very small amount of money, 4-figure budget, you have a property now. And you
Yeah.
go online and you say, if you've got a tiny and you're looking for a place for it, I have a spot in this address, and you've got utility hookups, and here's the rules. And now you've got a tenant. And that's a really great way for somebody to add value to their property. And then they can always develop a structure in addition to that or instead of that. Or, like it's just another option. And
Yeah.
from a housing perspective, like I acknowledge that tiny houses cannot be a large percentage of the solution because they are not very flexible forms of housing. I mean, they're flexible in that they can move sometimes, but they're not flexible for like large families. They're not flexible for seniors. We have a real aging in place crisis looming where everybody wants to retire where they live, almost, but basically nobody lives in a house that's ready to age in place. That's just not how we've been building for the past few decades. So adding tiny homes is not going to solve that problem. What it does, though, is it takes usually young people who are willing to live in a tiny, and it takes them out of competition for the large housing market, and
Mm,
that might be helpful too. So
got
I'm
it.
all about them. They're great. They're a great additional arrow in the quiver. Like basically, anytime I'm a yes in my backyard guy, right? So anytime there's an idea I can say yes to, I'm like yes, let's try
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. That's
And if they're and let's watch. And if 5 years from now we go, there's some unintended consequences. Let's make some rules about those consequences. But
yeah.
we got to stop saying no to ideas because that hasn't worked. That's got us where we are.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a great point. And you mentioned the utility hookups, which I think is really important because I think a lot of people see a price tag on a tiny home on the side of the street that's like, oh, wow, it's only $40,000 to have a home. You know, it's so
Yeah.
cheap. And then they don't think about all that goes into that, all the structure underneath of it, the utilities to it. Maybe you build a deck around it. Like all of a sudden, like to your point, it turns into a six-figure project. Is there a way that you could do this off grid? Have you seen that done where people are building ADUs that they don't require all the underground to them?
So this comes down to that local planner or your level of comfort with risk. But
Yeah.
so you can the off grid technology has advanced remarkably
Yeah.
even since I've been in the space. And like what the super battery factories and stuff like that have done to battery costs is really great. So um, what the biggest challenge with going off grid before in a permitted situation was you needed to have a really expensive battery setup to be legal off grid.
Mm,
Now those battery setups are relatively affordable. Like, I think I want to say low 5-figure, high 4-figure. So So you can have a completely off grid solution with your own solar or whatever energy production solution you want, and you can achieve that. And it's actually like I was just at the HUD Housing and Urban Development in DC, did a innovative housing showcase on the National Mall. And I didn't put the video of the solar battery guy in the sizzle reel. Maybe I'll upload that separately and give you a link when I do. But
Okay.
but there are really, really incredible solutions that are on market and available now. Very interesting. Totally worth investigating if that's what you want. But again, the first question is like, you call the planner and you're like, hey, if I wanted to put a little structure on this property off grid, is that an option for me? And like get them into the conversation. Unless you have a very high threshold for risk, and like if you're not using it for strangers, like a short term rental, and you're using it for yourself, I'm not going to tell you what
Yeah.
to
Yeah. Yeah.
do.
Yeah. Yeah. Some off grid people are, the thought of even talking to a government official makes them
Exactly.
cringe. So,
Exactly.
yeah.
Well, and they're probably not looking to me for advice.
Yeah.
If
Yeah.
you're doing that, you got this, buddy. Like,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. No, I appreciate that answer. That's interesting to know that there's a lot more solutions these days, for that technology, which is great.
yeah, and it's getting cheaper every day,
Yeah,
which is fantastic news. So
yeah.
totally. Oh, and sorry. So that's electrical, and then like there are toilets that you can get the incinerating toilets. You could be on septic, which is less independent off grid, but it's doable. And then there's also like I just saw one again at that housing showcase where they got like a NASA toilet in there, and it has an organic compound that digests your black water and separates it into like gray water and reusables, and like it's a whole thing. So
Wow.
more solutions becoming available all the time for the things that would keep you on grid in the past century.
Yeah, yeah. Interesting. Wow. Um, One thing I was curious about, too, is, my wife and I talk about, like, one of the biggest regrets we have around, you know converting this barn, because we've been operating it for about 2 years now, and it's just been fantastic. And we're like, we wish we had used some of the other space, because it's a huge 55 by 65 foot pole barn. It's massive. But we wish we would have just made 2 units out here instead, because there's so much demand for it. People love coming to the farm and stuff. Um, have you seen people build multi-unit ADU structures?
Yeah, you're hitting all my favorite things from this innovation showcase, actually. So, yes, you can put multiple units in a single structure, and it goes back to that townhouse argument I was making.
Yeah.
It's way better in a lot of ways. There's a lot of energy savings from shared wall. You can still create a lot of sound privacy these days. It's not a bad solution, and especially for short term, like
Yeah.
people will be very happy for the cost savings. Um, there are a couple of those states that I've just listed. It used to be like we would eke for it a lot and be like, you could build one ADU, you could build one ADU and a junior ADU. You could build both. Slowly we build up to like you can actually build three. Now states are coming out the gate and being like, you can build two ADUs,
Oh,
and
okay.
if they do that, you can look and see, do I have the ability on my lot to put them both in one structure? In California, there's a lot of different ways to get to that form, whether it's an ADU or an SB9 or blah blah blah. There's a lot of tools, and then specifically the first HUD code duplex. So this is a manufactured house, coming off the line at Fleetwood, like one of the big manufactured home manufacturers, and they are creating a single section duplex. And what that means is you're getting 2 units on one truck, and they share a wall. They have 2 kitchens, 2 bathrooms, and 2 entrances. And this is going to in my opinion, it's going to revolutionize the cost of developing 2-unit properties. You're going to be able to plop these down, skip a lot of the inspection phases, not all of them, but a lot of the inspections happen at factory with manufactured housing, and
Mm.
you're basically looking at on-site inspections and utility connections. And you're just going to speed up the timeline on producing duplexes in a really incredible way. And it'll have a dramatic impact on costs. So That's really exciting. And yes, absolutely. If you've got either what you talked about, a big building that you're trying to convert, or greenfield development, both always think about shared wall multi-unit.
Yeah. Wow. That's awesome. I never, really considered that to be the case until we did this one. And then I was like, wow, we probably could have just added a second unit there and would have made a ton of sense. And I think, I mean, for my audience who are, really mostly investors, just from a number standpoint, like if you think about it, a lot of like I think our best deal might be the one we just finished up, and it's a single family home that had an ADU in the back, but it was all gutted and it already had the utilities to it. But we bought it for the same price as another single family home. Like they didn't really count that as extra value when they were selling it. So, we fixed up both they both needed a big rehab. So we fixed up both of them. But it wasn't that much more to fix up this small ADU in the back. So our expense side of the equation is basically the same as if we had bought a single family, but yet we're bringing in an extra $2,500 a month from this short-term rental, which if you think about it, that goes straight to the bottom line. It's like pure profit. There's no extra. I mean, there's a little bit extra utility expense and that sort of thing. But I mean, it just, from an investment standpoint, this multiple unit strategy, just, it blows everything else out of the water from everything I've seen. So,
and today it's a lot of buy and hold because it's great math. But then these are going to accrue like people are going to learn how to price ADUs differently. California now allows some places to condoize and sell the ADU separately. That will establish separate values for the ADUs. That's already happening in Texas and Seattle too. And so all of these changes will also mean that as you sit on the property and use it, it's actually not financial advice, but I think of it as a value that's accruing, an asset that's accruing value because the perceived value in market is changing over time.
Yeah.
Whereas, it's just a really exciting opportunity.
Yeah. Well, especially with millennials coming in, right out of college, a lot of them have debt. Like they can't afford a like big property, or a single family home that they're going to have to pay for themselves. So buying a property where the back unit pays for the whole property, it makes so much sense. So from a value standpoint, I think the more of those that become like, the more that becomes a common practice, the more value people are going to place on that because they're going to realize this is just a way to free myself of this huge debt burden.
Totally. And this is an extreme example, but as we just don't have enough options, right? And so in a really tight housing market like the South Bay or East Bay, where I'm at, there are guys building 300 square foot micro units and renting them out for like $3,000 a month, but on 3-month or less leases, right? So they're focused. They know their customer. It's a traveling professional. It's a student for a short term, and it's a lot of money for what it is for that renter, but it's 300 cheaper than the next cheapest thing. And so for the renter, they're like, that's my option. Like I would much rather be alone in a studio unit than sharing and competing with a huge market for a house where I have to find 4 roommates and we're like fluctuating all the time. And so that's a market that exists because you're the cheapest thing on the market or the most affordable thing on the market. So you actually get a premium for your investment. And like you just have to he has to juggle vacancy differently than everybody else does. But there are ways to think about that stuff, right? And so the more you explore the fringes, there's risk, but there's also some interesting opportunities where you're like speaking to a market that just doesn't exist. And so that's also interesting.
Yeah.